The evening sun was setting over Pine Grove neighborhood, painting the sky in soft orange hues. A young boy, just 12 years old, was riding his blue bicycle down Maple Street, enjoying the cool breeze on his face. He had just finished his homework and gotten permission from his mom to ride around their block before dinner, something he did almost every day. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sharp flash of police lights. Officer James Miller, who had been parked in his patrol car watching the street, pulled up beside the boy. The child immediately stopped his bike, his heart racing a little, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his parents had taught him to be extra careful around police officers. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Officer Miller's voice was stern as he stepped out of his car. He shined his flashlight directly at the boy's face, even though it wasn't fully dark yet. "I live here, sir," the boy answered politely, his voice steady despite his nervousness. He pointed toward a beautiful two-story house just 2 doors down. "That's my house right there, the blue one with the white trim." Officer Miller's expression hardened with disbelief. "Sure you do," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I've been patrolling this area for years, and I've never seen you before. This is a nice neighborhood, kid. Why are you really here?" The boy tried again, speaking clearly and respectfully, just as his parents had taught him. "Sir, we moved here 3 months ago. You can ask Mrs. Chen next door. She brings us cookies every Sunday." But Officer Miller wasn't listening. Instead, he grabbed his radio and called for backup, treating a simple bike ride like a serious crime in progress. Neighbors began peeking out their windows, and a few came out onto their porches, phones in hand, recording the scene unfolding before them. "Step off the bike," Officer Miller commanded, his hand resting on his belt. The boy carefully got off his bicycle, his legs shaking slightly. "Put your hands where I can see them." The child raised his hands slowly, still trying to explain. "Sir, my dad's a doctor at Central Hospital. We really do live here. Can I please call my parents?" "Stop talking and turn around," Officer Miller interrupted, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clicked coldly against the boy's small wrists as neighbors gasped and whispered among themselves. One woman, Mrs. Chen, rushed inside, presumably to call someone who could help. The boy stood there, frightened but brave, remembering what his parents had always told him. "Stay calm, be respectful, and the truth will come out." He didn't know it yet, but in just a few moments, everything was about to change. His father, one of the most respected doctors in the city, was already on his way home from work, about to turn onto their street and witness something no parent should ever have to see. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street as tension filled the air. This quiet evening in Pine Grove was about to become a moment that would transform not just one officer's perspective, but an entire community's understanding of prejudice and justice. The steel handcuffs felt cold and heavy on the young boy's wrists as he stood there on the sidewalk, his beloved bicycle lying on its side in the grass. Officer Miller paced around him, speaking into his radio about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. The evening air grew thicker with tension as more neighbors gathered on their porches, phones held high, recording everything. "Please, sir," the boy said again, his voice trembling slightly but still polite. "My house is right there. Can't we just walk over and check?" "Quiet," Officer Miller snapped, his face reddening. "If you live here, why haven't I seen you before? Why are you riding around when it's getting dark?" Mrs. Chen, the kind neighbor who always brought over home-baked cookies, couldn't stay quiet anymore. She stepped off her porch, her phone still recording. "Officer, I can vouch for this child. He lives next door to me with his parents. They're a wonderful family." But Officer Miller waved her off. "Ma'am, please step back. This is police business." His dismissive tone made several neighbors shake their heads in disbelief. The boy's eyes started to water, but he blinked hard, remembering his father's words about staying strong in difficult moments. He stood straight, even with his hands cuffed behind his back, showing a dignity far beyond his 12 years. A small crowd had gathered now. Mr. Peterson, who lived across the street, stepped forward. "Officer, we see this young man riding his bike here almost every evening. His father is a doctor at Central Hospital. You're making a huge mistake." Officer Miller's radio crackled with a response about backup being on the way. He seemed to grow more agitated with each neighbor who spoke up, his authority being questioned in front of so many witnesses. "Listen," he said, his voice rising. "If everyone doesn't step back right now, I'll have to." The rumble of a car engine interrupted him. A silver luxury sedan turned onto the street, slowing down as it approached the scene. The boy's face lit up with relief as he recognized the sound of his father's car. The neighbors watched as the car pulled up smoothly to the curb. The engine shut off, and in the growing dusk, a tall figure stepped out. The man wore an expensive suit and carried himself with natural authority, but what stood out most was the hospital ID card still clipped to his jacket pocket. Chief of Surgery at Central Hospital. Officer Miller's face began to change as he watched the distinguished-looking man approach. The crowd of neighbors parted respectfully, many of them nodding in greeting to the doctor they'd come to know as a friendly and respected member of their community. The boy's father walked forward with measured steps, his expression calm, but his eyes taking in every detail of the scene. His young son in handcuffs, the overturned bicycle, the gathering of concerned neighbors. In that moment, the power dynamic on that quiet suburban street shifted completely, though Officer Miller didn't quite realize it yet. The evening was about to become a turning point that would change not just one family's life, but an entire community's understanding of justice, prejudice, and the power of dignity in the face of discrimination. "What's going on here, officer?" The father's voice was calm, but carried natural authority as he approached the scene. Everyone could see the hospital ID badge gleaming on his suit jacket in the fading light. The crowd of neighbors fell silent, watching. "Sir, this is a police matter," Officer Miller said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Please step back." "That's my son you have in handcuffs," the father replied, his words measured and clear. "I'm Dr. Thompson, Chief of Surgery at Central Hospital, and this is my home." He gestured toward the blue house with white trim, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. Officer Miller's expression shifted from dismissive to uncertain. He glanced at the handcuffed boy, then at the distinguished man before him, making the connection too late. The neighbors murmured among themselves, phones still recording. "Dad," the boy called out, his voice steady despite everything. "I was just riding my bike like always." The father nodded, then turned back to Officer Miller. "My son is 12 years old. He rides his bike here every evening after finishing his homework. We've lived in this house for 3 months. Now, would you please explain why my child is in handcuffs on his own street?" Mrs. Chen stepped forward again. "Doctor, I saw everything. Your son was just riding his bike when the officer stopped him. He tried to explain he lives here, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. The father listened, his face a masterclass in controlled emotion. He turned back to Officer Miller. "Your badge number, please." His tone wasn't angry or threatening. It was professional, the same voice he might use when asking a nurse for surgical instruments. Officer Miller's hand moved unconsciously to cover his badge. "Sir, I was responding to suspicious activity in the area." A child riding his bicycle is suspicious. The father raised an eyebrow. "Or is there something specific about my son that made you suspicious?" The question hung in the air. Several neighbors nodded, knowing exactly what the doctor was implying. Mr. Peterson, still watching from across the street, called out, "We've all been watching this happen, doctor. Everything's on video." The father nodded thoughtfully, then spoke again to Officer Miller. "I'm going to need your badge number, your name, and your supervisor's contact information. Then you're going to remove those handcuffs from my son. After that, We're going to have a longer conversation about what constitutes suspicious activity in this neighborhood. The growing darkness couldn't hide Officer Miller's reddening face as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. But this wasn't going to end with just an apology. This moment was about to become something much bigger than one officer's error in judgment. The neighbors watched as the story unfolded before them, knowing they were witnessing something that would change their community forever. The way the father handled the situation, with dignity, restraint, and an unwavering commitment to justice, would become a powerful lesson for everyone present. Officer Miller's hands shook slightly as he removed the handcuffs from the boy's wrists. The metal had left faint marks that made the father's jaw tighten, but he maintained his professional composure. The neighbors' phones kept recording, capturing every moment of this increasingly tense situation. Badge number 7842, Officer Miller finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer James Miller. The confidence he'd shown earlier had completely evaporated as he faced the respected doctor. The father pulled out his phone and carefully noted down the information. "And your supervisor's name and contact?" he asked, his tone remaining measured and professional. Officer Miller provided the details, knowing this incident wouldn't simply disappear. As this exchange happened, something unexpected occurred. Another police car pulled up, the backup Officer Miller had called for earlier. The new officer stepped out, immediately recognizing the doctor. "Dr. Thompson," the arriving officer said with surprise, "is everything okay here?" This officer had a different demeanor entirely. He'd been a patient at Central Hospital just last month, where the doctor had treated his mother during an emergency. The father turned to the new officer. "Actually, no. Everything is not okay. Your colleague here just handcuffed my 12-year-old son for riding his bicycle in front of our house." The backup officer's face showed genuine concern as he looked between his colleague, the boy, and the gathering of neighbors. "Sir, I am so sorry. I had no idea. Officer Miller, what's going on here?" Officer Miller stumbled over his words. I was responding to suspicious activity." "The only suspicious activity here," Mrs. Chen interrupted, "was the way this officer treated an innocent child. We all saw it. We all recorded it." The backup officer nodded gravely. "Dr. Thompson, I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated. Your work at the hospital and your reputation in the community are well known. This should never have happened." The father raised his hand. "My reputation shouldn't matter," he said firmly. "What matters is that no child should be treated this way, regardless of who their parents are or what neighborhood they live in." His words hit home with everyone present. The neighbors murmured in agreement, and even Officer Miller looked down at his feet, the full weight of his actions finally sinking in. The boy had picked up his bicycle and now stood close to his father, showing remarkable composure for someone so young. The father placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about protection, love, and dignity in the face of injustice. This moment wasn't just about one officer's mistake anymore. It was becoming a mirror reflecting deeper issues that needed to be addressed. The father's measured response and powerful words would soon spark changes that would ripple through the entire police department and beyond. By morning, videos of the incident had spread across social media like wildfire. Local news vans lined the quiet suburban street, their reporters eager to interview anyone who had witnessed what happened. But instead of feeding into the anger and outrage, the father took a different approach that surprised everyone. He walked out of his house in his surgical scrubs, ready for another day at the hospital, and calmly addressed the gathered media. "What happened last night wasn't just about my son," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's about every child who has ever felt afraid in their own neighborhood. Instead of pointing fingers, let's work together to make sure this never happens again." The father's words hit home with many people. Inside the police department, phones were ringing nonstop. The chief of police, watching the viral videos and seeing the doctor's response, knew this required immediate action. He reached out personally to set up a meeting with the family. Meanwhile, the boy went to school as usual, showing incredible strength. His classmates had all seen the videos, and many shared their own similar experiences. The school principal called an emergency assembly to discuss what had happened and create a safe space for students to share their feelings. Back at the police station, Officer Miller sat in a quiet room, watching the body camera footage of his actions. For the first time, he saw himself through others' eyes, saw how quickly he had jumped to conclusions, how he had ignored the neighbor's attempts to explain, how he had handcuffed a child for simply existing in his own neighborhood. The father's phone kept buzzing with messages of support. Community leaders, other doctors, and even state officials reached out. But what touched him most was a letter from another police officer, one who worked in youth outreach. "Your response to this incident," the letter read, "gives us a chance to make real changes. Would you consider working with us to build better relationships between law enforcement and our community?" That evening, the family sat down to dinner together. The boy's mother, who had been out of town during the incident, held her son close. "I'm so proud of how you handled yourself," she told him. "And your father's right. We're going to turn this into something positive." As they ate, more neighbors stopped by. Mrs. Chen brought her famous cookies. Mr. Peterson offered to help organize a community meeting. Even people from other neighborhoods came by to show support and ask how they could help create positive change. The father looked at all these people gathered in his living room, united in a desire to make things better. He realized that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best opportunities for change. Tomorrow, he would meet with the police chief, but he wasn't going alone. He was bringing the community with him. The police department's conference room was packed with people the next morning. The police chief sat at the head of the table, surrounded by internal affairs officers, community leaders, and Officer Miller. The father sat opposite them, calm and composed in his surgical scrubs. He had scheduled this meeting before his hospital shift. The room fell silent as they watched the body camera footage. Not just from that evening, but from Officer Miller's previous stops too. A pattern emerged. Young minorities frequently stopped, questioned, and treated with suspicion in nice neighborhoods. "This isn't about punishing one officer," the father said, breaking the tense silence. "It's about changing a system that allows these incidents to happen repeatedly." The police chief nodded slowly, the evidence before him undeniable. "Dr. Thompson, what would you suggest?" The father pulled out a carefully prepared proposal. "First, we need better training. Not just about policies, but real connections with the community. Second, we need regular reviews of body camera footage, looking for patterns before incidents like this occur. And third, we need consequences, but also paths to improvement." Officer Miller, who had been silent until now, spoke up. His voice was different from that evening, humbled, thoughtful. "I've watched these videos over and over," he said. "I never saw myself as, but the evidence is clear. I need to do better. We need to do better." The chief picked up the father's proposal. "We're implementing immediate changes. All officers will undergo new training. We're establishing a community oversight board. And Officer Miller, you're being reassigned to desk duty pending completion of our new program." The father raised his hand. "If I may suggest, instead of just desk duty, involve Officer Miller in the solution. Let him work with our community youth program. Sometimes, the best way to overcome prejudice is through direct interaction and understanding." The suggestion surprised everyone, especially Officer Miller. He looked at the father with newfound respect. "After what I did to your son, you trust me to work with kids." "Trust needs to be earned," the father replied. "But change needs to be given a chance. My son showed incredible dignity that evening. The least we can do is show the same grace in finding solutions." The meeting continued, with real plans taking shape. Body cameras would be reviewed monthly. Community members would participate in officer training. And most importantly, bridges would be built between the police and the people they served. As the father left for his hospital shift, he felt hopeful. Sometimes, the worst moments could lead to the best changes, if people were willing to learn and grow from them. At the community center, Officer Miller stood nervously before a small group of children and their parents. It had been 6 weeks since that fateful evening, and here he was, part of the new youth outreach program. The father had suggested this program, believing that real change comes from understanding and connection. "I made a mistake," Officer Miller began, his voice shaky but sincere. "A big one. I judged someone without knowing them, and I was wrong." He looked at the faces watching him, children of all backgrounds, their parents, and community members who had given him this chance to make things right. The boy was there too, sitting beside his father. When Officer Miller had requested to apologize to them personally, the father had suggested doing it as part of this program instead. "Let your apology be the start of something bigger," he had said. Officer Miller shared his story openly. He talked about growing up in a different time, in a neighborhood where he never really got to know people who looked different from him. He spoke about how fear and prejudice can build up without us even noticing, and how it takes courage to face our own biases. "But knowing better means doing better," he said, echoing words from his recent training. "And that's why I'm here. Not just to apologize, but to learn and to change." What happened next surprised everyone. The boy raised his hand and stood up. "Officer Miller," he said clearly, "I accept your apology. But I have a question. Would you like to join our basketball game after this? We're one player short." The room fell silent. Officer Miller looked at the father, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be honored," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Though I should warn you, I'm not very good at basketball." The children laughed, and just like that, the tension broke. As they moved to the basketball court, parents and kids mixed together, sharing stories and experiences. Officer Miller found himself in conversations he would have never had before, learning about different lives, different perspectives, and different challenges. Later that evening, as everyone was leaving, Mrs. Chen, who had brought snacks for everyone, smiled at the sight of Officer Miller high-fiving the kids goodbye. "Sometimes," she said to the father, "the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes." The father watched as his son gave Officer Miller a fist bump before running over to join him. In just 6 weeks, so much had changed. The police department was implementing new training programs, community meetings were becoming regular events, and here, in this community center, real connections were being built. The local park buzzed with activity as families gathered for the first ever Police Community Unity Day. What started as one officer's mistake had grown into something remarkable. Kids played basketball with police officers, parents chatted with community leaders, and the smell of Mrs. Chen's famous cookies filled the air. The father watched from a bench as his son helped organize games between officers and local kids. In just 3 months, their story had inspired changes beyond what anyone expected. The police department had completely revamped its training program, with community members now leading sessions about their experiences. Officer Miller, wearing a casual police department t-shirt instead of his uniform, was teaching younger kids how to safely ride their bikes. "Remember," he called out, "safety first, but having fun is important too." The irony of this moment wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story, but it showed how far things had come. The police chief walked over to join the father on the bench. "Your son's story changed our entire department," he said, watching the activities. "Last week, we had officers from 3 other cities visit to learn about our new community program. The boy had started a youth advisory council where kids could talk directly with police officers about their concerns and ideas. Today, they were showcasing their latest project, a series of posters designed by local children showing positive interactions between police and community members. Mrs. Chen, now the head of the Neighborhood Watch program, was organizing a group of volunteers. They had started a mentorship program pairing officers with local youth for weekly activities. "Who would have thought," she said to the father, "that such a terrible evening would lead to all this?" The local news crew had come to cover the event, but this time they weren't reporting about conflict. Instead, they captured images of officers playing double dutch with kids, helping with homework at the community center, and learning about different cultures from local families. Officer Miller approached the father, wiping sweat from his forehead after the basketball game. "Doctor," he said, "I never thought I'd say this, but that night, it woke me up. Made me see things differently. Your son taught me more than any training manual ever could." The father smiled, watching his son referee another game. "Sometimes," he replied, "our children become our greatest teachers." 1 year later, the school auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and community members. On stage stood the unlikely duo, the boy, now 13, and Officer Miller, ready to share their story once again. A year ago, the boy began, looking confident despite his young age. "I was just riding my bike in front of my house. What happened next could have made me afraid or angry. Instead, it taught me that change is possible when people are willing to learn and grow." Officer Miller stepped forward, his badge shining under the lights. "I was that officer who let prejudice cloud my judgment," he admitted. "But thanks to this young man and his father, I learned that being a good police officer means being part of the community, not apart from it." The audience listened intently as they shared how their story had sparked changes across the city. The police department had become a model for others, with over 50 departments nationwide now using their community engagement program. Pictures flashed on the screen behind them. Basketball games at the community center, study sessions where officers helped with homework, cultural festivals where police and residents celebrated together. Each image told a story of bridges being built. The hardest part, Officer Miller shared, wasn't admitting I was wrong. It was facing my own biases and deciding to change. But look at us now. He gestured to the boy beside him. "This young man taught me more about courage and dignity than any adult ever has." The boy smiled, then added, "And Officer Miller taught me that people can change when we give them a chance. Now, when I ride my bike in the evening, officers wave and ask about my basketball games." After their presentation, Mrs. Chen, now running a successful police community relations program, approached them with tears in her eyes. "From that terrible night came all this good," she said, hugging them both. The father, watching from the back of the auditorium in his surgical scrubs, felt pride swell in his chest. His son had helped turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Officer Miller had transformed from someone who caused pain to someone who helped heal it. As people filed out of the auditorium, chatting excitedly about what they'd heard, a young officer in training stopped to thank them. "Your story changed how I think about being a police officer," she said. "It's not just about enforcing laws. It's about being part of the community we serve." The boy and Officer Miller exchanged a knowing look. Their story wasn't just about what happened that night anymore. It was about what could happen when people chose understanding over anger, growth over blame, and hope over fear.